The first shot hit Outpost Orion 9 without warning, without ceremony, without even the courtesy of a demand, and in that instant every human on station understood something was terribly wrong, because space itself had gone silent before the alarms began. The kind of silence that only comes when something ancient and deliberate has decided you are already dead. The station was small, barely more than a rotating ring in a spine, drifting at the edge of a forgotten trade corridor, where stars were thin and signals weaker still. A place chosen specifically because nothing ever happened there, a place where humanity believed it could breathe without armor. The outer hull folded inward under the impact, metal screaming as energy burned through layers designed for micrometeorites, not war, and inside the habitation ring, lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized in a dull emergency red as gravity held and the station refused to break apart. No one screamed, no one ran. The men and women of Orion 9 had trained for this, not because they expected it, but because humans never assumed the universe was kind. Across the station, scientists secured experiments, engineers sealed ruptures, medics moved before calls were made, and in the command center, a single officer stared at the tactical display as alien signatures bloomed like a sickness around the station. They were Krell. Everyone knew the name. Fast raiders, brutal enforcers, a species that built its empire on the idea that fear traveled faster than fleets. The Krell ships did not form a neat formation or broadcast threats. They fired again, deliberately targeting communications arrays and docking arms, not enough to destroy the station, just enough to make it helpless. And the Krell commander, watching from his flagship, allowed himself a thin smile, because this was how submission began. To him, Orion 9 was a message, not a target, a demonstration to the galaxy that human expansion could be cut at the edges like rot from fruit. Inside the command center, the human officer exhaled slowly and opened a secure channel that bypassed local relays entirely, routing through a quantum thread laid down decades earlier by people who no longer remembered why it existed. And he recorded a single sentence with no emotion in his voice, because emotion wasted time. Outpost Orion 9 is under attack. He sent it, closed the channel, and returned to coordinating damage control as if he had just filed a routine report. Somewhere, far beyond the reach of Krell sensors, that message arrived. On Earth, deep beneath layers of rock and silence, it appeared on a screen in a room that had not heard raised voices in generations. No alarms sounded, no red lights flashed. Senior commanders read the words and did not ask for more. They did not ask who fired first, because that question had already been answered by the existence of the message itself. Humans did not send distress calls lightly. A woman at the center of the room, her hair gray and her posture unbent by age, looked up and asked the only question that mattered. And when the answer came, she nodded once. That was enough. Across Earth and its scattered colonies, systems that had slept without power began to wake, not explosively, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of something that had always been meant to wake this way. Fleets that did not exist on public records received encrypted instructions, drives calibrated against physics itself aligned.
To any outside observer, nothing changed. To humanity, the line had been crossed. Back at Orion 9, the Krell continued their methodical assault, carving pieces from the station while deliberately avoiding a killing blow, savoring the slow collapse they believed was coming. And among them, confidence grew, because the humans were not begging, not transmitting surrender codes, not even broadcasting outrage. One Krell officer laughed and remarked that humans always made speeches before they died, and the others agreed, unaware that humans had learned long ago that words were for before and after, never during. Minutes passed. Then something strange happened. Sensors aboard the Krell flagship registered a distortion at the far edge of the system, so faint it almost registered as background noise, a ripple that did not expand or flare, but simply appeared, like a thought intruding where none had been before. The sensor officer frowned and adjusted filters, expecting a glitch, but the signal persisted, wrong in a way that made his secondary hearts tighten. He reported it to the commander, who dismissed it as stellar interference until more ripples appeared, aligned, evenly spaced, approaching not with speed, but inevitability. The Krell brought weapons to readiness, amused more than alarmed, expecting a human relief fleet to arrive late and die bravely for propaganda. What emerged instead did not match any known registry. The ships were human, unmistakably so in their blunt geometry and utilitarian design, but they were old, their hulls dark and unmarked, their drives emitting no readable signature, as if they were not so much traveling through space as ignoring it. The Krell commander scoffed and ordered his fleet to hold fire, choosing to observe rather than waste ammunition on relics. The human ships did not hail, they did not maneuver defensively. They passed Orion 9 without slowing, without acknowledging the burning station at all, and that was when uncertainty crept into the Krell command, because no species ignored its own wounded unless something else mattered more. Targeting solutions failed as the ships moved deeper into the system, distances refusing to resolve, vectors slipping like oil through claws, and for the first time, the Krell commander felt the cold edge of doubt. On the bridge of the lead human vessel, officers watched displays with calm focus, their voices low, their movements precise, and one of them remarked quietly that if anyone was listening, now would be a good time to subscribe, because what followed would not be recorded twice, a dry joke that drew no laughter but settled nerves all the same. The captain waited until a final indicator turned green, then spoke a sentence that would later be replayed in alien councils across the galaxy with growing horror. Course confirmed. Primary objective unchanged. Behind them, Orion 9 burned. Ahead of them, far beyond the Krell fleet's understanding, something waited that had already been judged. The Krell commander opened a channel at last, demanding explanation, threatening annihilation, asserting dominance, but the human ships did not answer. Instead, they accelerated in a way that broke every rule the Krell understood, space bending softly around them, and in that moment the commander realized with sudden clarity that the battle for Orion 9 had ended the instant the first shot was fired, and whatever came next was not war, but consequence. The Krell commander watched the human ships disappear deeper into the system and felt the uneasy sense that something fundamental had shifted, not tactically, but existentially, as if the universe itself had quietly changed its posture, and around him his officers struggled to re-establish sensor locks that refused to behave. Ranges collapsing into nonsense, timestamps drifting out of sync, and every corrective algorithm spitting back the same impossible result, that the human vessels were not accelerating so much as arriving where they intended to be. He ordered a pursuit out of pride more than reason, unwilling to accept that any fleet could simply pass through his formation untouched, and Krell ships surged forward with engines blazing, only to find themselves lagging behind targets that were not moving faster, but farther, receding into a geometry that no longer obeyed straight lines. Back at Orion 9, another section of hull gave way, and a firestorm ripped through an unpressurized lab. But containment fields held, and the station endured in a wounded equilibrium that spoke of careful design and stubborn intent, and the humans inside continued their work as if survival were a duty rather than a hope. The Krell bombardment slowed, commanders distracted by the anomaly unfolding deeper in the system, and it was in that moment of divided attention that a junior Krell analyst noticed something far worse than strange engines. The human ships were not heading toward reinforcements or safe space or even a rally point. Their vector, once finally resolved by brute force extrapolation, pointed unmistakably toward the Krell home system. The analyst hesitated before speaking, knowing the weight of the words, but discipline overrode fear, and the report was made. The bridge fell quiet as the implications settled. The Krell commander barked a laugh and dismissed it as psychological warfare, insisting no species would dare strike a core world over a border outpost.
But his confidence rang hollow even to himself, because the humans had not threatened, had not postured, had not attempted deterrence at all, and that absence of communication now felt deliberate rather than passive. On Earth, the response continued with the same unhurried precision, command chains activating in silence, dormant arrays aligning across light years, and within vaults sealed before the Krell species had discovered metallurgy, records were accessed that described contingencies not for invasion, but for erasure. Plans written by people who understood that some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The woman who had authorized the response stood alone for a moment, looking at a holographic projection of the Krell home system, not with hatred, but with the calm focus of a surgeon preparing for an amputation, and she murmured that this would be discussed later, that for now, execution mattered more than explanation. The human fleet exited transit not at the edge of the Krell system, where defenses clustered and early warning stations bristled, but inside, between orbital layers, materializing in perfect formation as if the system itself had been designed to receive them. Krell sensors screamed as power readings spiked and vanished, distances oscillated, and automated defense platforms attempted to lock targets that refused to exist where they were supposed to be. The human ships held position, silent and dark, their presence an insult to every assumption the Krell had ever made about warfare. On the lead vessel, the captain reviewed incoming data streams from Orion 9, noting casualties, damage, survival rates, and he closed the file without comment, not because it did not matter, but because it already had. And another officer quietly suggested that anyone listening this far would want to stay to the end, because this was the part histories argued over. A meta-remark that slipped into the narrative like a shared secret between storyteller and witness. The Krell High Command erupted into chaos as reports flooded in from their home system, defense grids failing to synchronize, shield harmonics collapsing under feedback loops no one understood, and civilian traffic clogging orbital lanes as panic spread faster than official statements. Emergency councils convened, ancient treaties invoked, and a desperate signal was broadcast on every frequency toward the human fleet, demanding explanation, demanding negotiation, demanding time. The humans did not respond. Instead, small objects detached from the human ships, so unremarkable they barely registered, drifting toward the planet in slow, graceful arcs that mocked the frantic scramble of defense cannons, trying and failing to acquire firing solutions. Krell scientists raced to identify the devices, running simulations that returned null results, because whatever the objects were, they did not emit energy, did not reflect scans, did not behave like weapons at all. On Orion 9, a human engineer paused amid repairs and looked up as a faint tremor passed through the station, not from another hit, but from something else, a resonance that made the bones of the structure hum, and she wondered briefly what that meant before returning to her work, because survival demanded focus. The Krell commander at the Outpost finally grasped the magnitude of what was unfolding and ordered a full retreat, abandoning the attack in a belated attempt to save something, anything, but hyperspace corridors that had carried his fleet in now refused to open, navigation solutions failing as if the universe itself had revoked permission. His ships were trapped, spectators to their own extinction. Above the Krell homeworld, the small human devices reached critical altitude and vanished, not exploding, not impacting, simply ceasing to be detectable. And for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then planetary shields flickered and went dark, not shattered but shut down, as if a master switch had been thrown. Power grids across continents failing in cascading blackouts, communications dying mid-sentence, and the realization spread through billions of minds that their world had been rendered helpless without a single visible blow. The Krell high speaker transmitted again, voice breaking, offering withdrawal, reparations, vassalage, anything. And at last a reply came from the human flagship, a single channel opening long enough for one sentence to be heard. You attacked a human outpost. The channel closed. In the void above the planet, deeper systems activated, not with violence, but with inevitability, and within the planet's crust, ancient stresses began to shift, as if something fundamental had been nudged out of alignment. On the bridges of the human ships, officers watched readouts with solemn attention, knowing that comments and reactions would be analyzed later by those trying to understand how such calm could coexist with such destruction. And one officer remarked softly that this was the moment people would argue about in the comments, whether it was justice or terror, and whether there had ever been another choice, a thought that lingered like an invitation rather than a plea. Back at Orion 9, the Krell fleet received fragmented telemetry from their homeworld, images of cities going dark, of oceans surging against silent shores, and then the feed dissolved into static, and the commander sank into his command throne as the truth settled that he had not lost a battle, but ended a civilization. Above the Krell planet, the first tectonic failure rippled outward, invisible from orbit but catastrophic in effect, and the human fleet remained motionless, watching as processes set in motion long before any of them had been born began to complete their cycle. The galaxy, still unaware, still busy with its own petty conflicts, had not yet felt the shockwave of what was about to happen, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it would change the meaning of the word consequence forever. The Krell homeworld did not explode, not at first, and that was the detail later historians would fixate on, because annihilation would have been easier to understand than what followed. A slow, deliberate unmaking that felt less like an attack and more like a sentence being carried out. From orbit, the planet looked intact. Blue oceans still turning beneath cloud bands, continents still lit by dying power grids, but inside its crust something had changed, a foundational balance disrupted by forces that did not tear but persuaded, nudging stresses that had slept for millions of years into alignment with inevitability. Human instruments registered it as confirmation, a quiet cascade of green indicators that told the fleet the process had begun and could no longer be stopped without intervention they had already decided would not come. On the flagship bridge, no one spoke for a long moment, not out of awe, but out of respect for the weight of what they were witnessing. And the captain finally broke the silence to remind his crew that records would be sealed, that no imagery would be released, that history would know this only as a consequence, not a spectacle. Below them, Krell cities began to fail in sequence, not randomly, infrastructure collapsing along fault lines of dependency rather than geography, transit hubs going dark, life support towers in dense urban centers shutting down as backup systems tripped over one another. And across the planet, the realization spread that there would be no rescue because there was no enemy to fight, only a system quietly finishing a calculation. The Krell High Command dissolved into panic and accusation, ancient rivals blaming one another for provoking a power they had never truly understood. And in their desperation, they did what they had always done when faced with extinction. They tried to frighten it away, broadcasting threats of retaliation that no longer had targets. On Earth, the same woman who had authorized the response watched a simplified projection update in real time, continents shifting by fractions of degrees that translated into kilometers of devastation, and she closed her eyes briefly, not in regret, but in acknowledgement, because this was the cost of keeping a promise made generations earlier that no human would ever again be abandoned at the edge of space. Far from the homeworld, the Krell fleet trapped near Orion 9 finally received a coherent data burst, a compressed archive of their civilization's last moments, sent automatically by systems designed to preserve legacy. and as the files decrypted, the commander saw images of cities collapsing inward, of oceans flooding inland, of skies burning red from atmospheric shear, and his mandibles trembled as he understood that the humans had not simply destroyed their planet, they had removed its future. Around him, officers fell silent, some in shock, some in rage, some in a hollow acceptance that there would be no victory songs sung in Krell halls ever again. At Orion 9, the human outpost endured its final hours of crisis, fires extinguished, hull breaches sealed, casualties stabilized, and when the immediate danger passed, a medic paused to look at a news feed that had begun to populate with fragments of rumor from the wider galaxy, whispers of a core world gone dark, of a power moving without warning or explanation, and she felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition, because she knew, in a way no alien ever could, that this was not humanity unleashed, but humanity contained. The human fleet above the Krell homeworld received the final confirmation as planetary mass redistribution crossed the irreversible threshold, the core destabilizing in a way that would tear the world apart from within over the next few hours, and the captain gave the order to disengage, not because it was finished, but because it was decided. The ships turned as one, bending space again with that same quiet refusal to announce themselves, leaving behind a planet that would soon become a field of debris, its moon scarred, its orbit forever empty. As they departed, an automated buoy was released into deep space, not as a warning or a marker of conquest, but as a record, a single immutable data crystal containing the timeline of events from the first shot at Orion 9 to the moment the fleet left Krell space, encrypted in a way that any sufficiently advanced civilization could eventually read, and that crystal would drift for centuries, waiting to be found by someone curious enough to ask why an empire had vanished. News of the event spread anyway, carried by traders who noticed the sudden absence of Krell traffic, by listening posts that picked up the silence where 1,000 signals used to be, and by diplomats who received no replies from a species that had once answered every message with arrogance. Alien councils convened in emergency sessions, replaying what little data they had, struggling to reconcile the image of calm human ships with the scale of destruction attributed to them. And again the same question arose, not why the Krell were destroyed, but why the humans had not said anything first. On a neutral world far from both powers, an old analyst leaned back from a holoscreen and murmured that if you were listening this deep into the story, you already understood the lesson, and you might want to share it with others before someone else learned it the hard way, a thought that echoed quietly across the network as speculation and fear intertwined. Back at Orion 9, a human officer stood at a viewport watching the stars, aware that the Krell fleet still hung in space nearby, leaderless and trapped, and he wondered what would be done with them now that their home was gone, a question that lingered unanswered as a new signal appeared on long-range sensors, faint but unmistakable, indicating that other powers were watching, learning, and perhaps preparing to act. Somewhere in the dark between stars, the consequences of the Krell's mistake were still unfolding, and humanity had not yet decided how much of the galaxy needed to be taught the same lesson. The galaxy did not react all at once to the silence where the Krell Dominion had been, because disbelief travels slower than fear, and fear itself hesitates when it encounters something too clean to blame on chaos. At first, it was merchants rerouting around dead lanes, captains muttering about sensor ghosts and missing checkpoints. Then it was intelligence bureaus noticing that every Krell relay had gone quiet within the same hour, not gradually as in a civil collapse, but abruptly, like a breath held and never released. Councils convened in rooms designed for spectacle and shouting, and found themselves subdued by the absence of data, because no one could find a battle to point at, no debris field to analyze, no triumphant human broadcast to condemn. The humans had not claimed anything. They had not expanded borders. They had not even spoken. On Orion 9, a provisional calm settled as rescue craft threaded through the wreckage, bringing fresh air and steady hands, and the wounded were moved without ceremony, because there would be time later to feel whatever was owed to survival. The Krell fleet still hung nearby, engines cold, crews paralyzed by the knowledge that there was nowhere left to go. And when a human patrol vessel finally approached them, it did so cautiously, not out of fear, but out of protocol, opening a channel that carried no threat and no mercy, only instructions for disarmament and compliance. The Krell commander listened, hollow-eyed, and complied, because resistance had become a meaningless word. Far away, alien analysts argued whether the human response had been automated or deliberate, whether it represented doctrine or exception, and those arguments mattered because they would determine whether borders closed or wars began. On Earth, the sealed rooms returned to quiet, operators logging off systems that would not be accessed again for decades if humanity was fortunate, and the woman who had authorized the response recorded a private note for future leaders, reminding them that restraint was not kindness, but discipline, and that discipline was what separated guardians from monsters. The human fleet dispersed, not returning home in triumph, but slipping back into obscurity, their existence once again reduced to rumor and inference, while a single diplomatic packet was prepared and transmitted on open channels, addressed not to any one species, but to all who listened, containing no images of destruction and no lists of demands, only a statement of principle that would be parsed and reparsed in 1,000 languages. It said that humans sought peace, trade, and understanding, that they did not strike first, and that they did not repeat warnings. And that message landed like a shadow across the galaxy, because it explained everything without apologizing for anything.
In the wake of the Krell's erasure, smaller powers quietly abandoned plans for raids along human peripheries. Pirates avoided systems with unassuming human installations, and even ancient empires adjusted fleet doctrines, instructing their admirals to treat human space as a region of uncertainty best left undisturbed. On Orion 9, reconstruction began almost immediately, not with fanfare, but with shipments of raw materials and updated schematics, the new station designed to look much like the old one, modest and unthreatening, because humans understood the value of being underestimated. A young technician asked an older officer why they did not build bigger defenses now, why they did not make a statement of strength. And the officer replied that statements invited replies, and replies were expensive. Across the galaxy, stories spread anyway, embellished and distorted, some claiming the Krell had been punished by cosmic accident, others insisting the humans wielded forbidden weapons, but the most unsettling versions were the quiet ones, told by people who had studied the timelines and noticed that from the moment the outpost was attacked to the moment the Krell world was doomed, there had been no hesitation at all. In a neutral archive world, scholars began compiling the incident, labeling it a turning point, and debates raged over whether humanity's action had preserved peace through terror or simply postponed a larger conflict. And if you were listening this far, you could hear those debates echoing even now, inviting opinions, inviting arguments, inviting the kind of discussion that spread stories farther than any fleet. The Krell prisoners were transported to internment habitats where they would live out their lives in silence, their culture preserved only in records, and one of them asked a human guard why there had been no warning, no ultimatum, and the guard answered honestly that there had been one, delivered the moment the first shot was fired, because for humans, intent mattered more than outcome. As months passed, sensors along Orion 9's perimeter detected new arrivals, observers from distant powers claiming scientific interest or diplomatic curiosity, and each of them kept their weapons powered down, their trajectories precise, their communications deferential. Humanity watched them all, not with suspicion, but with attention, because attention was the first line of defense. Somewhere beyond known space, signals began to converge on the drifting data crystal left behind by the human fleet, ancient probes and curious minds drawn to the mystery of a vanished empire. And when the first of them finally cracked its encryption and understood the sequence of events, a message was sent back toward its own people, warning them that the galaxy had changed and that some mistakes could not be survived. And in that moment, as more eyes turned toward human space with a mixture of fear and fascination, humanity faced a new question it had not yet answered: whether the lesson learned by the Krell would be enough, or whether another civilization would someday decide to test the rule written in silence. The first challenge did not come with weapons or fleets, but with questions. And questions, humans knew, could be more dangerous than guns when asked by the wrong people. It began quietly when a coalition of mid-tier powers requested a formal inquiry into the Krell event, framing it as concern for galactic stability rather than accusation. And their diplomats arrived in human space with polite language and carefully neutral postures, their ships immaculate and their crews visibly tense. They were escorted to a neutral station where the walls were plain and the gravity steady, and there they were met not by admirals or heroes, but by administrators who spoke calmly and provided exactly what was asked for and nothing more: timelines, causality, confirmation that humans had not struck first. The coalition representatives pressed for details about the weapon, the mechanism, the threshold, and the humans responded with the same measured clarity they used in all things, explaining that the specifics were classified, that the principle was public, and that no further commentary would be provided. The diplomats left dissatisfied but unsettled, because there had been no deception to argue against, no emotional outburst to exploit, only a firm boundary that did not move. As they departed, one of them remarked to another that anyone still listening to these events unfold should pay attention now, because this was where myths turned into policy, and policy shaped survival. Elsewhere, less patient powers drew different conclusions. In a distant sector, an expansionist empire that had watched the Krell fall decided that humanity's response, while terrifying, was also proof of restraint, that humans acted only when provoked, and that provocation could be engineered at a scale small enough to test the limits without triggering annihilation. They chose a target that seemed safely ambiguous, a joint research habitat staffed by humans and non-humans alike, and they moved covertly, masking their ships as pirates, planning an incident that could be disavowed if necessary. The attack was swift and brutal, lives lost in the confusion, and the perpetrators vanished into deep space before any clear attribution could be made. On Earth, the report arrived with the same quiet efficiency as before, but this time the room did not move immediately, because this was different, muddier, and intent mattered. Analysts reconstructed trajectories, compared signatures, traced financial flows and political motivations, and when the conclusion was reached, it was not shouted, but written, a single line stating that while the attackers wore masks, the hand behind them was visible. The woman who had authorized the Krell response was no longer in that chair, but her successor read the report and felt the same weight settle on his shoulders, because the rule had been tested not openly, but cleverly, and cleverness demanded a different kind of answer.
The response that followed did not involve fleets leaving docks or space bending under quiet engines. Instead, trade algorithms shifted,
Patents were challenged, resource rights reclassified, and within months the expansionist empire found itself hemorrhaging influence as allies withdrew and internal dissent surged. Their markets collapsed, not from sabotage, but from lost confidence. Their borders strained as protectorates demanded autonomy, and their leadership realized too late that they were being dismantled piece by a power that understood systems better than war. On Orion 9, now fully rebuilt and humming with life, a veteran officer briefed new arrivals on protocols and history, ending with a simple warning that humanity's strength was not in how hard it could hit, but in how patiently it could wait, and that anyone foolish enough to force its hand should expect an answer that fit the crime. Across the galaxy, observers noted the pattern and adjusted their behavior again, concluding that humanity possessed not one terrifying response, but many, each calibrated to intent and scale, and that unpredictability, not aggression, was the true deterrent. In quiet corners of space, fringe groups began to whisper about uniting against the humans before they became untouchable, while others argued that such unity would itself be seen as provocation, and the debates grew heated enough to fracture alliances before they ever solidified. The data crystal left drifting after the Krell's fall was finally recovered by an ancient exploratory vessel, its crew old and cautious, and when they decrypted its contents, they did not rush to share it, choosing instead to study the implications, to ask whether the humans had acted out of fear, anger, or something colder. Their eventual report concluded that humanity operated on a moral framework that prioritized protection over dominance, and that violating that framework carried consequences proportional to the threat posed, a finding that circulated slowly but inexorably through academic and military circles alike. As the galaxy absorbed this understanding, a new variable emerged, one no model had predicted, because within human space itself, questions were being asked by younger generations who had grown up hearing rumors but seeing no proof, wondering what it meant to live under a rule enforced by shadows, and whether that rule could one day be turned inward. Those questions did not yet threaten stability, but they unsettled leaders who understood that unity required trust, and trust required transparency, something humanity had never been good at when survival was on the line. Far beyond settled systems, in a region unclaimed and uncharted, a signal flickered to life, ancient and powerful, drawn by the same distortions that had marked the human fleet's passage, and whatever received it began to stir, aware now that a species existed which could erase worlds without announcement. The galaxy did not know it yet, but the lesson taught to the Krell was about to be examined by something far older and far less forgiving.
The signal did not announce itself as a threat, and that was what made it dangerous, because it carried no malice, no curiosity, no emotion at all, only a structured echo of the distortions the human fleet had left behind, as if something vast had noticed a footprint and decided to follow it. Deep space arrays across multiple civilizations detected it independently, a low-frequency resonance that ignored distance and interference, and analysts dismissed it at first as background noise until it repeated with mathematical precision. On Earth, buried sensors that had been dormant since before Orion 9 was built came online without human input, their activation protocols triggered by patterns no living operator had ever been trained to recognize, and in the sealed rooms the silence returned, heavier this time, because the systems waking now were older than any current government and existed for a reason that history had tried to forget. The human response was immediate but invisible, data rerouted, observation platforms repositioned, and exploratory probes dispatched along vectors that did not appear on public maps. Humanity did not know who was watching yet, but it knew enough to understand that the galaxy had noticed the Krell's absence, and something beyond the familiar empires was asking why.
On Orion 9, life continued in a studied normalcy, research teams cataloging stellar anomalies, trainers docking under relaxed protocols, and security officers watching the dark with practiced patience. And one of them remarked quietly that this was the part of the story where listeners usually leaned closer, because the universe rarely let lessons stand unchallenged. Alien councils convened again, this time not to discuss humanity, but to discuss the signal, each species terrified that it might be the next focus, and in those chambers the Krell were no longer spoken of with contempt or pity, but with envy, because their mistake had been simple and brief, while others now faced an unknown that might not care about intent at all. The signal grew stronger, resolving into structures that suggested intelligence without identity, movement without propulsion, and presence without mass, and scientists struggled to classify it within any known framework, eventually agreeing only that it was ancient and that it had been dormant until recently. On Earth, a classified archive was opened by unanimous consent, its contents describing encounters from humanity's earliest expansion. Fragments of logs from lost ships, references to watchers and auditors that appeared whenever civilizations crossed certain thresholds of power without sufficient restraint. The conclusion, drawn reluctantly, was that humanity's precise destruction of the Krell homeworld had marked it as something new, a species capable of altering stellar-scale outcomes with intent, and that such capability attracted attention from entities that did not negotiate or retaliate, but evaluated. The human fleet that had erased the Krell remained silent and sealed, but another layer of response began to form, not military but existential, as philosophers, strategists, and ethicists were quietly consulted under non-disclosure, tasked with answering a question no one had wanted to ask before: whether humanity's doctrine of consequence would hold if faced with something that did not value life the way biological civilizations did. In distant systems, stars flickered subtly out of rhythm, navigation routes shifted by fractions that accumulated into danger, and explorers reported the unnerving sensation of being observed by something that did not need eyes. The signal's origin was triangulated at last, pointing not to a world or a fleet, but to a region of space thought empty, a void between clusters where nothing should persist, and the revelation sent a ripple of unease through every intelligence service that received it. Humanity prepared a message, not as a threat or greeting, but as a declaration of presence, a statement that it was aware, that it had noticed the Watcher in return, and that it would not act without understanding, a choice debated fiercely behind closed doors because some argued that silence had protected them before. The message was transmitted, encoded in mathematics and causality rather than language, and for a long moment there was no reply. Then the signal changed, its pattern tightening, focusing, and a new distortion appeared closer to human space than anyone found comfortable. On Orion 9, long-range sensors flagged the anomaly, and an officer felt a chill run through him as he realized that whatever had been watching was no longer content to observe from a distance, and that for the first time since the Krell's fall, humanity might be the one standing at the edge of an unanswered question. The anomaly arrived quietly, almost politely, as if it understood that it did not need to announce itself with fire or noise. And when the first structures emerged from the distortion, they were neither ships nor natural formations, but something in between, shapes that bent space around them in subtle arcs, moving as if reality itself obeyed a different set of rules. Humans detected it immediately, not because their sensors were superior, but because they were trained to notice the impossible and prepare for it, and the fleet activated contingency protocols that had existed for generations, protocols whose very existence had been whispered about in alien space as legend. Across the galaxy, other powers noticed the movements, and suddenly the lesson of the Krell was being revisited. The humans had not struck first, but the consequences of crossing their line were absolute, and now it seemed the line was being observed. On Orion 9, officers prepared the station for emergency operations, reinforcing structural points and recalibrating defensive systems that had never been intended to face anything so incomprehensible. And yet there was no panic, because humans did not panic. They calculated, they adapted, they endured. The anomaly did not communicate in words or signals, it simply moved, and as it aligned with human fleets, the distortions it caused began to cascade across space-time, confusing alien scanners, delaying transmissions, and making targeting solutions laughably impossible. Senior commanders on Earth watched displays that flickered with impossible numbers, distances that stretched and compressed, and mass readings that defied gravitational laws, and they issued commands with the same calm precision they always had: hold position, observe, contain, do not provoke. Small, unmanned human probes were dispatched into the anomaly, returning data that could not be interpreted fully by even the most advanced AI, yet each reading confirmed a horrifying intelligence at work, something older than the known galaxy, capable of understanding patterns of behavior across light years and centuries. The human response was neither aggressive nor submissive, it was deliberate. Every ship, every sensor, every calculation was synchronized to anticipate the anomaly's decisions, and officers on the bridge spoke in measured tones, acknowledging that the observer might not care about life, morality, or diplomacy, but humans would treat it as they treated every threat, with preparation, precision, and patience. Meanwhile, alien species watching from afar panicked. Fleets that had survived countless wars froze in space, unsure how to respond to something humans themselves regarded with calm caution. And historians tried to record what was happening, noting that humanity's reputation for lethal accuracy and merciless consequence now seemed almost irrelevant against a presence that did not act as any known civilization did.
On Orion 9, a young technician asked an older officer whether they were afraid, and the officer replied that fear was for those who had no plan. Humans always had a plan, sometimes for things that no one else could comprehend, and sometimes that plan required waiting while the universe itself revealed its next move. The anomaly began to mirror the fleet's movements subtly, testing, probing, assessing, and every reading was logged, calculated, and fed into contingency layers designed to respond not with anger, but with effectiveness, the humans showing the kind of discipline that left alien watchers in silent awe. Then, the first unexpected shift occurred. A portion of the anomaly disengaged, accelerating toward a cluster of colonies on the galactic fringe. Communication reached the colonies too late to warn them fully, and alarms screamed across habitats, but human ships were already on calculated intercept courses, not to attack, not to fire, but to contain, to neutralize the immediate threat while preserving the integrity of the larger engagement, and the fleets executed their maneuvers flawlessly. Across alien space, simulations of human behavior were updated with the new data. Humanity did not act emotionally, did not seek glory, and did not chase vengeance. Humans acted with consequences in mind, and that understanding spread like wildfire. Observers began to realize that the Krell's fate had been a lesson, but the anomaly now represented a test far beyond anything the galaxy had seen before. On Earth, commanders deliberated over encrypted channels, fully aware that if they misstepped, the galaxy might never forgive them. And yet the decision was unanimous. The humans would respond, not as conquerors, not as diplomats, but as caretakers of a stability the universe had not yet recognized it needed. And in the void beyond the human fleets, the anomaly paused, studying, waiting, and it became clear that the next phase of the galaxy's reckoning was about to begin, not with a warning, not with a first strike, but with the same quiet inevitability that had erased the Krell.
The anomaly's final movement was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a shift in the fabric of space that left entire sensor grid blinking with inconsistencies, and then, with an inevitability that made fleets across light years tense, it began to converge on human positions with purpose, as if measuring, cataloging, and weighing not just firepower, but intent, discipline, and the calculus of consequence itself. Human commanders watched calmly, knowing that what was about to unfold was not a war to be won with speed, aggression, or intimidation, but with understanding, precision, and the kind of patience only a species that had survived countless existential threats could practice. Orion 9 and all nearby fleets moved in tandem, creating patterns of deployment that appeared chaotic to outside observers, but were, in fact, meticulously calculated redundancies designed to anticipate every possibility, every vector, every contingency. Across the galaxy, alien species paused their own operations, noticing that the humans were no longer a question mark, but a variable too dangerous to ignore, their every movement silent proof that they did not act on impulse and they did not act without absolute cause. The anomaly approached a fleet cluster, and for the first time it emitted a pattern recognizable as communication, not in words, not in language, but in intent, a signal parsed as query, challenge, and assessment all at once. Human analysts received the data in real time, feeding it into layered simulations that had been prepared decades in advance, and the response crafted by the human fleet was surgical, immediate, and invisible, a countermeasure that did not destroy, did not threaten, but demonstrated capability beyond comprehension. The anomaly paused, its trajectory shifting slightly as if recalibrating, studying the humans in the same way they had studied the Krell. Yet there was no fear, no overreaction, only precise observation and quiet command execution. Within minutes, the anomaly's shape changed, folding in on itself, breaking into smaller units that attempted to probe fringe systems, and each attempt was met with an invisible barrier, a counterforce, a lesson in restraint and consequence delivered not through firepower, but through absolute control of the battlefield. Across Orion 9, technicians monitored every fluctuation, scientists recorded every anomaly, officers coordinated every fleet element, and not once did panic rise, not once did chaos emerge, because humans had learned that true power was patience, and patience allowed them to turn inevitability into resolution. Far beyond the human fleets, sensors from the wider galaxy recorded the engagement, replayed it in simulations, and every alien strategist concluded the same horrifying truth. Humanity was not merely a civilization to fear because of what it could destroy, but because of how it thought, how it waited, and how it executed with cold, precise logic. The anomaly's probes were neutralized, absorbed into patterns that left no trace but disruption, and then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the presence receded, folding back into the void from which it had come, leaving no wreckage, no signatures, nothing to mark its passage except for the calm, unbroken human formations now standing where chaos had threatened to bloom. On Orion 9, officers allowed themselves brief exhalations, medics and engineers returning to routines, and the captain of the lead vessel finally addressed the crew, not with cheers or speeches, but with a single statement that would echo in histories for generations: mission complete. Across the galaxy, the ripple of understanding spread that humans did not fight for pride, for territory, or for conquest, that their power was measured in the inevitability of their response, in the precision of their decisions, and in the unspoken lesson that crossing a line drawn by humanity carried consequences that could not be negotiated, avoided, or survived. The Krell were gone. The anomaly had withdrawn, and the galaxy, for the first time, understood in quiet, chilling clarity that humanity was not merely a participant in galactic affairs, but a force defined by consequence, discipline, and the unerring patience to ensure that threats were never repeated. And on Orion 9, looking out at the stars where fleets had once gathered and shadows had once stirred, a young officer turned to his mentor and asked quietly if they would ever strike first, to which the veteran replied simply, without hesitation, without emotion, "We never strike first. Humanity does not need to. The galaxy will always remember." The story ended, but the lesson endured, an unspoken rule carved into the void. Underestimate humanity, and you do not get a second chance.